Hi, and welcome to CryptoBiography. I'm your host, Brandon Starr, and this is episode 158, and it's part 5 of The Island. And here we go. The next few weeks were quiet, with Carden focusing on his fishing, the children helping him, and particularly Gwen, with Gwen working on building another room on the house. The 3 children all had one room, and they were all getting big. There was some forest land on the island, but it was not particularly close to their house. While some timber had been used, particularly for the roof, the walls were all of the rock that was much more easily gotten. There was a beach nearby with a cliff, and the rocks of the cliff were fine for wall making, tending to be flat and not too large. The neighborhood shared a wagon for these sorts of things, and the Gwensprun family used it for weeks on end, with all of them at different times going to fetch wagon loads of stones. Carden knew that the walls were fast being completed, and several timbers would be needed for the roof joists. With that in mind, he took Tristan in the boat, and they went down the coast a couple of miles. They brought the one axe they owned, tied down tightly, just in case of rough seas, and made for a forest that went practically down to the beach. There was a partly protected angle they could make for, and they pulled the boat well up on the beach. The tide was nearly high, as they had planned. Still, Tristan took out the anchor and dropped it next to the boat. If something unusual happened, the boat would not be able to go too far. They spent a few hours chopping down a large oak and removing the branches. It was a fairly young oak and was still mostly straight, but the trunk was thick enough to make several beams. By the time they were finished, the sun was nearly down, their water skins were empty, and the small amounts of dried food they had brought were eaten. The work was hard, and when one took a break, the other picked up the axe. But now they were done. Dragging the oak to the water was also hard work, but they used the branches as skids and rolled the tree down to the water near the boat. When the trunk was just about floating, Tristan went and pulled the boat into the water. The anchor stayed for the time being so that he could jump out of the boat to help Carden. Carden tied the tree to the boat. His knowledge of knots was great, and though he would have trusted Tristan to do it, he felt it would be better if he did this work himself. The great tree was starting to rock a bit in the water, still not quite enough to float in. Tristan helped instead by handing him lengths of rope as he passed them around the trunk. Carden had to go down in the water one last time to pass the rope around the trunk when a wave rolled the trunk partway over. His hand was caught, and his face was underwater. He pushed, but he had no leverage to move the trunk from his position. He took his free hand, which was still well above the waterline, and slapped the trunk. Tristan was with him in a flash. He could tell his son was first trying to push the trunk away, but apparently he couldn't quite do it. Then he stepped away, and being unable to see, Carden instead focused on holding his breath and working his hand out from under the trunk. It was held fast, and he could barely move his hand. He started digging under his arm with his free hand, but it was slow going. He hoped the water would recede enough for him to catch a breath soon. His lungs were burning. Suddenly the trunk rolled away from him, and he brought his head up out of the water, taking a huge gulp of air. Tristan had found the longest remaining branch and pulled up on it with all his strength. The leverage was just enough for him to move the great log. Carden looked at his hand. It wasn't bad, considering. He'd done more damage to the skin trying to pull it free than any other damage. The wet sand had been just soft enough to keep his bones from being crushed, even if it hadn't allowed him to free himself. Carden started laughing, looking at his hand, shaking his head. Tristan looked a little confused, then started laughing too. "How foolish would it have been to die under a tree I just cut?" Carden asked, and rested a bit on the log. "Thank you, son. Well done." Tristan went around the other side of the log and pulled the rope over. Carden finished the tying of the knots, though his hands were shaking from the experience. Then they got in, Tristan first, taking the oars and starting to pull away from shore. The log followed easily, and Carden checked to make sure the knots were good. Then he waited, then swam after the boat, pulled himself in, noting that in his exhaustion it was far harder than it should have been, and flopped onto the bench seat. Tristan kept pulling, and they made their way back home. Carden found himself growing worried. Not much time had passed between Kier's saving of the boy from drowning and their adventure today. Would Tristan think that Carden had set it up, pretended to be caught, so he could play the hero? Hopefully the cuts and scrapes on his hand and arm would be enough to keep that from happening. They pulled the log home and got it well up on the beach. The next day, Carden started splitting it. It was going to take a good amount of time, but he knew if he just kept working on it, it would be done. That day, however, his work was cut short by a severe storm. The whole family brought the boat well up on shore and tied it to some trees. The log, not easily moved, was tied with long ropes to a large rock. The rain was hard indeed, with lightning and rough seas. The family went inside, and because it was too loud for conversation, they sang songs and played games. Like so many hard rains, it was soon over, and Carden went back to work on the log. The time of day and the still stirred-up waves would mean no fishing for the rest of the day. He went back to splitting the log. The first split was nearly done, and each swing was causing the crack to lengthen. The progress made him grin. But he stopped grinning after he looked out to sea. The waves were showing, from time to time, a boat. Carden found himself watching. No one on the island would have gone out in this weather, and the storm would have been seen for too long for anyone to still be out there when it came. How was anyone caught in this? Or was the boat empty? Had it escaped its mooring? Carden looked harder. The boat clearly didn't have anyone at the oars or paddles, but it didn't look empty either. It seemed to him that someone, unconscious or dead, was lying in the boat. It's a season for saving others, Carden thought. He wouldn't risk his children or Gwen in this weather. No, he must do this one alone. He went for the board. Sometimes, mostly for fun, he or the kids would take a long board out on the water and paddle around. The boat would take too long to get there, and high seas were terrible for rowing in a boat anyway. He knew from experience that the board would cut through the waves much better and get him there. Along with the board, he snagged a hook on a rope, thinking he may have need of it. Then he ran for the water, board over his head. And that's the story for today, obviously. We're going to keep going with this. And if you have any comments or questions about this episode or previous episodes, CryptoBiography@gmail.com, or hit us up on Facebook or Twitter. And thanks for listening. Words of music, copyright 2020, CryptoBiography LLC, all rights reserved. Characters and events are fictional, fictionalized, or satirical.